The race is on, and Max Verstappen took a record-equalling 9th consecutive victory on home sand at Zandvoort, resisting everything the weather and Fernando Alonso could throw at him. But did Red Bull give him strategic assistance in his battle with teammate Sergio Perez, and did his rivals miss an opportunity to inflict a rare defeat? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me with all the answers are Mark Hughes and Scott Mitchell-Malm. Well, Scott, how are you? I can't hear any intense techno music in the background, so you must have left the Netherlands.
Left the entire country. They do love a particular brand of music here. Been hearing it incessantly over the last few days.
Still going.
The media centre here is, I think it's right under the Paddock Club, isn't it? Mm. So we've basically had a non-stop rave. But it's been fun. The Dutch fans have been in fine voice. I've been getting the train in and out of the circuit pretty much every single day on the actually named Max Express from Amsterdam to Zandvoort, and even early in the morning they're in fine spirits, and I probably can say well lubricated even early in the morning, some of them. So it's been quite the experience as it was when I came here for the first time last year.
Excellent. Well, I'm expecting a rave of a podcast to follow in keeping with that. And Mark Hughes, looking very much ready for a rave on this particular podcast. Are you feeling enthused after what was quite a dramatic race?
Oh, totally. Yeah, and I'm off to a rave as soon as you finish this. So if you could hurry up, please. I'd like to get on with it.
When you say rave, do you mean writing endless things all night?
Yeah, that's a rave, isn't it?
You've been doing this too long, far too long. But yeah, that is the standard Sunday night thing. But it's great when there's an interesting race. So let's get into it. Mark, underpinning Max Verstappen's victory, it was the usual story of the combination of him and the RB19 being the quickest car. So answering the question of how the race was won, can you actually outline the various ways perhaps a lesser driver might have found to lose it rather than win it?
Yeah, there were plenty of opportunities to lose it. I mean, even before the race started, you saw in qualifying Q1, his very first lap, he almost put it, he went through the gravel, but it beached there, that he had been starting from the back. And even Max Verstappen in the Red Bull RB19 might not have won from there. So he might have done. But in the race itself, it was one of those calls at the end of the first lap. What do? You've started on slicks, but all of a sudden the rain has arrived. How long is the rain going to be there? How heavy is it going to be? And what's the correct thing to do? He played it safe, just was guided by the team. But turned out that the best thing to do at that time was to do what his teammate Sergio Perez did and pit immediately. The next best thing to do was to pit on the next lap, which is what Red Bull had Verstappen do. The next best thing was to stay out on your slicks, which is what Alex Albon and a few others did. It put you a minute behind or so, but it saved you 40 seconds worth of pit stops. And the worst thing to do was to stop on lap 3, which is what Lando Norris and Lewis Hamilton did for McLaren and Mercedes, respectively. So Max didn't have the prime strategy, but he had the safest, not a bad strategy. It put him about 13, 14 seconds behind Perez by the time he rejoined. But his pace advantage was just outrageous, and he was onto the back of Perez. Yeah, I think he took 7 seconds out of them in 3 laps, something like that, in the same car. So yeah, it was. It would have been easier to have, one of his passing moves to go wrong when he was coming through, rejoining after his stops. It would have been easy to try a little bit too hard and end up in the gravel, all those things. But he put himself back in control, and it was a different sort of domination. It was total control over a wildly varying set of circumstances, and he and the team were just on top of it throughout.
Yeah, it's classic Verstappen, wasn't it? Not just really quick, but on top of the car. Whole crew was absolutely on it as well, as they always are for this weekend, and just made something quite difficult look quite easy. Scott, are you having any sympathy for Sergio Perez, given he got that track position advantage? Should he have pitted first? He was obviously a bit baffled by Verstappen undercutting him.
No, not a huge amount of sympathy. Ultimately, one of the reasons he got that track position advantage early on, and you could argue was then accidentally or deliberately undercut by Verstappen. The only reason he was in that position was because he'd done a bad job in qualifying relative to Verstappen. I'm sure if roles were reversed and Verstappen's the second car, it's much easier to roll the dice when you're not the first car on track, literally, as Verstappen was, by leading the entire pack, but also just the first car in your respective team. And I think one of the points to make is, just to follow on to what Mark was saying, is that, Verstappen could have come unstuck by any one of the ways that caught out Perez over the last 24 hours 30 hours or so now. He could have underachieved in qualifying. He could have stayed out too long on a set of intermediates. He could have managed the intermediates less effectively. He could have slid off the road when the rain got really heavy on intermediates. He could have sped in the pit lane. Any one of these things could have struck Verstappen and, if not cost him the race outright, complicated it massively. But there were no missteps like that. He's performing at such an immensely high level. And that's why I can't look at any part of this race and think, oh yeah, Checo was actually a bit unlucky there, because he and everybody else deserved to be beaten. Maybe with the slight exception of Fernando Alonso, who I thought did an absolutely fantastic job. But I do think Verstappen is just at such a high level at the moment that you can't begrudge him any victories, least of all a victory like this. I know that he's equalled Sebastian Vettel's win record, the consecutive win record, and he's won so many Grand Prix this year, and he's clearly going to win the championship. But just because this goes down as another win, just because this goes down as the record equaling win, it's not just another win. I would argue that this is one of, if not the best wins of his season in terms of how much he had to deal with. And I just don't think he gets quite enough credit for that. So I can't begrudge him the victory or offer Perez too much sympathy, to be honest.
I'd agree completely with that. As we said, there's so many ways that you can lose a race like this, and it looks so easy when you don't drop the ball on any of those multiple opportunities, but it's incredibly difficult to do. It's literally a juggling act that he's performing, and Verstappen does that better than most. He's absolutely driving fantastically at the moment. He wins races in so many different ways. Obviously the pace is always there, but yeah, he just doesn't drop the ball, or at least not very often. Let's talk a bit more in depth about Perez, Scott, because he had another up and down weekend. 1.3 seconds off Verstappen in qualifying, finished fourth, lost a position to that 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane. And there was that backdrop of those interesting comments from Helmut Marko. So was this a good weekend for Perez, a bad weekend, a par weekend?
It was a weekend. It was
weak weekend.
Yeah, it was a weak weekend. It very much fits into the narrative of Perez's season since the Miami Grand Prix, doesn't it? Where he's just comfortably second best on one lap pace. His races aren't as clean or as impressive. And the Marko stuff was amusing. That's the word I used. Felt a little bit like Helmut Marko doing Helmut Marko things. I don't think Helmut, as much as he plays by his own rules, I don't think he says stuff just for the sake of saying stuff. I feel like there is always a reason for doing it. And the fact is, in two separate interviews with two different publications going into the race weekend, he had said that they want to keep Checo for 24, but it's not guaranteed. And I'm pretty sure it's the first time anyone at Red Bull has even intimated that he could be dropped for next year, because it goes against the narrative of the team for the whole season so far. But then after qualifying, he recanted a little bit in a different interview and said that Checo will definitely stay for next year. And after the race, I think Christian Horner, the team principal, said that Checo will be Red Bull racing driver in 2024. So it's amusing that going into the weekend, having done nothing since the summer break, since those back-to-back podiums before the summer break, where he reinvigorated his bid to be second in the World Championship, Checo's done nothing, so hasn't had a chance to do anything wrong. But he had his future being questioned by Marko, and then after a really underwhelming qualifying performance, and then a really, really shaky Grand Prix, difficult Grand Prix in a few different ways, had his position massively reinforced. So not really sure what's gone on there at all. It's just such a strange way for that conversation around his future to have kind of flared up again and then been played down. Just just a bit of a weird one.
I think the thing about Helmut Marko is you may like or dislike what he says, but I think he's pretty honest by and large in his public utterances. So there is always an essential truth there, even if he's later asked to perhaps pour a bit of cold water on the fire that he's started. But Mark, I'm going to throw in a bit of a preview to the final section of the podcast by dropping in a couple of questions from the Race Members Club about Perez. One is from Thomas Knight, who asks if it's too much for Perez to be as much as 4 seconds a lap slower than Verstappen in the wet. And the other from JK, who asks how on earth did Verstappen catch Perez so quickly after the first switch to Inters?
No, it's not too much. The difference between drivers in the wet can be exaggerated immensely. And it's not just a case of how quick you can drive a car as it is in the dry. It's more how at ease do you feel with it, because you can throw it off the road in a fraction of a second if you don't have that keyed in feel with it. So yeah, the differences are amplified massively. So it's not at all. It's unusual, but it's not at all unheard of. A quick driver to be that much quicker in the wet than a par driver, which is like Perez. And then as we talked about before, that just played out in those early wet laps on the Inters, as Verstappen had a task to do and set about doing it, and Checo was just hanging on as best he could, trying to build up a lead over the cars in between him and Verstappen. But that was just the difference laid bare, really. I'm absolutely certain that if you swapped them around and put them in different cars, you'd see the exact same pattern of Max being that much faster than Checo in the way.
When we talked earlier in the year about like what makes the Red Bull so good at different times, you've obviously talked about like the mechanical platform of the Red Bull and some of the limitations or risks that come with that kind of arrangement. I remember back in Melbourne when Checo was really uncomfortable with the car there. In wet conditions, is it possible that the traits of the Red Bull, he just gets caught out by them a little bit more? Because you just don't see Max lock up and slide off as often. I mean, he did in practice, didn't he? But
yeah, I mean, one of the things we talked a lot earlier in the season about the amount of anti-dive in the front suspension in order to give it this, great control of the aerodynamic platform. And it's not a new thing. It's been around for decades. But one of the downsides of that is it leads to a different feel on the brake pedal. It's not as it's not a conventional feel on the brake pedal. So grading how, what pressure you should be using isn't as easy, and that becomes doubly difficult when you reduce the surface grip, as happens in a wet, of course.
I think, however, when it comes to Perez, it's not just a this year thing, is it? He's never been a brilliant driver in the wet by F1 standards. He's fine, but he's not perhaps somebody you would bet the mortgage on thriving in wet conditions. So, as with quite a few drivers, it's just quite difficult for some of the reasons you alluded to there. But Scott, while we're talking about the world of Red Bull, it's probably a good time to take a bit of a detour to AlphaTauri. How big a blow is Daniel Ricciardo's injury to his hopes of convincing Red Bull to keep hold of him long term and perhaps even promote him to the A team?
Yeah, I would say it is a blow. I know that he put a social media post up after, I think it was sometime on Sunday evening. He's had surgery now in Barcelona just to try and tidy up the break in his hand. And he said, it's not a setback, it's part of the comeback, or however he framed it. But it is a setback. It is a blow, because not only is it a really unfortunate, physical setback in that he now has something to recover from. And I really hope he doesn't rush that and come back too soon, because he's not going to do Monza, obviously, and there's talk about him trying to come back for Singapore, but I can't imagine trying to do that Grand Prix with a recently broken hand. But every race he misses now is a race in which he should have been in the car proving himself to Red Bull. So he's only done 2 races, now he's been sidelined again. So there are how many races left when we came back from the summer break? Was it 10 races? Something like that. So if he misses he could miss 20, 30% of the chances that he had over the rest of the season to impress Red Bull. That's huge. That's a big chunk of your track time. And every race weekend he was going to build momentum. And I think Christian Horner did reference that was Ricciardo's big frustration was, he'd come back, he'd blown the cobwebs off before the summer break. He was really looking forward to getting in the flow of things, and that's been disrupted. So whether it's to get that AlphaTauri seat full-time in 24, whether it's the vanishingly thin chance, I think, that did exist of replacing Perez at Red Bull Racing, whatever case he needed to make had to be compelling. And it is harder to make that case when you're not in the car. And then the flip side of that is it's allowed the person that I think Ricciardo is competing with for that AlphaTauri seat next year in Liam Lawson into the car. So it is a significant complication, even if it doesn't ruin it entirely.
Yeah, and Lawson did a pretty good job, I thought, this weekend. It was a rather unpromising set of circumstances in that he was thrown in for FP3. Obviously, wet conditions don't really help because you'll ideally want dry conditions to familiarise yourself with the car. He hasn't driven the AlphaTauri. He drove last year's AlphaTauri and last year's Red Bull as well. He hasn't even done a huge amount in the simulator with the AlphaTauri either. So it was a very, very difficult one for him. So I think expectations had to be kept in check, and Saturday was quite difficult for him. He had that spin and kissed the wall in FP3, and then qualifying the second run on intermediates, he just didn't, by his own admission, push as hard as perhaps he should have done with the grip the intermediates provided, the fresh set of intermediates. Although on the first run he was about 4/10 slower than Tsunoda, and then the gap ballooned and he qualified at the back. But I must admit, I watched quite a lot of his race on board, and I was quite impressed. He made a good start. He mixed it on that first lap before pitting. He was very unlucky in the pit stop because they double stacked, but they messed up Tsunoda's pit stop. I'm not sure exactly what went wrong with Tsunoda, but he was parked in the pit box for a long time. So Lawson had to just park there, cramp pit lane at Zandvoort. So he, in doing so, blocked the Haas pit box. So he got a 10-second penalty for impeding Magnussen. Nothing he could have done about that. But he ran up in 11th place in that stint for a bit. And obviously the penalty dropped him to the back. Had that battle with Charles Leclerc. Past
I really like that.
Exactly, yeah, past Bottas and Magnussen after that restart. And, he mixed it with people. And I thought he did a pretty good job on his way to 13th. And yeah, battling with the Ferraris. Great fun.
I really like the Leclerc overtake, primarily because it was absolutely the wrong place, and it was the wrong thing to do to make the pass there, because it was always likely that then Leclerc was going to be right behind him, have the toe DRS and come back at him on the start-finish straight. It didn't matter. It didn't change anything in his Grand Prix. So why not do it? Why not send it down the inside of a Ferrari on your Grand Prix debut? And it was really well judged. The actual move itself was executed. It was quite sweet, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, although there was nothing from afar that wowed you necessarily, I think he looked pretty good in the race and did a very decent job. It was a free hit of a weekend for him. He's really preparing himself for Monza, isn't he? Getting his eye in. But I think, particularly in that race, he showed he wasn't overawed by it. He was willing to race with people. He got the start right. There were a lot of gently encouraging things. And I think he's given himself a nice foundation now for going into Monza, which it hasn't been confirmed officially, but I can't imagine Ricciardo will be back for Monza. Every chance he'll get Singapore, and beyond that, who knows? But yeah, I think he's probably enhanced his case slightly, and he's got his foot in the door. That's the absolutely crucial thing. So I'm interested to see how Lawson gets on. A nice solid start in very, very tricky circumstances, and he didn't do anything stupid, which was the number one objective, and finished the race. So good job from him. Mark, let's move back up to the front now and talk about Aston Martin. Fernando Alonso qualified fifth, finished second. So is it back to the early season form for Aston Martin after that slump recently, or was there also a big slice of Alonso magic in this result?
Very difficult to judge that one. They put the new floor on for this one, and they back-to-back it between the practice sessions, and it's very clear that the new floor is a significant improvement. So, yes, it's definitely better than where they were. But is it really faster than a McLaren or Mercedes? Difficult to judge, because Alonso was absolutely brilliant this weekend. And they avoided the booby traps of the early pit calls, or the lap 3 pit call that McLaren and Mercedes made, which so disguised their potential. But Alonso was, I'd say that was one of his finest races. Terrific, and a lot of thought behind it. He was explaining afterwards how that move that he put on Russell on the inside of turn 3, that had its roots in practice when he'd come out of the pits and there was some faster cars coming by, and so he just went there to sort of get out of the way and realized how he could feel that there's more grip here than I was expecting. And so he just filed that little bit of information away and thought I might be able to do something with that. And lo and behold, he did. Just things like that, as well as the genuine drive and brilliance. If you watch on board from, I think it was who would it be? Maybe Perez. You watch on board from Perez on that opening lap, and you watch some of the moves that Alonso is doing and where he's putting the car and how twitchy it is and how he's just getting away with it, but is completely, on top of it. You just realize you're watching something very rare, and he's still absolutely at the top of his game, and it was a wonderful performance all around, really. And so yes, the car is better than it was, but let's see where it's really at. Has it got itself back to that status where it was genuinely the second fastest car early in the season? I'm not sure if we saw that this weekend. It may have been, but not. I'm not. Let's wait.
And Alonso, of course, this is the 20th anniversary this week of his first Grand Prix win in Hungary in 2003. Still going strong. Obviously, slightly difficult weekend for Lance Stroll. I've actually got a little bit of sympathy for Lance Stroll this weekend because he finished 11th. I think he qualified there as well, but the strategy was just always not right. Even in qualifying, it wasn't on the intermediates, or the intermediate change I think was a bit early, so he didn't have the tyres at the end. And also, you talked, Mark, earlier about the sequence of ranking when to make your pit stop. And the one you didn't include, which I think was the one that was off the bottom of the list for disasters, was stopping on lap 4, which is what Stroll and Russell did. So, yeah, that just ruined the race for Stroll. And, yeah, obviously he wasn't at Alonso's level, but perhaps a slightly unfortunate weekend for him, you would say. Well, let's move on now, Scott, to our unexpected podium finisher, Pierre Gasly. The Alpine rollercoaster ride, of course, continuing. 2 bad days struggling for rear grip. Then Gasly got that 3rd place from 12th on the grid. So is this just Alpine's experience of chaos from earlier in the season helping it?
They're just as good at sort of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory as they are snatching victory from the jaws of defeat, I think. If you want a team that's going to be able to pull a rabbit out of the hat, I actually think Alpine's a pretty good contender for it. Because the peaks have been great. I mean, now both drivers have got podium this year. I don't know whether it's by coincidence, but both rain-hit races, although I would offer that Esteban Ocon's in Monaco was sort of just part of an all-round really competitive weekend. This was a lot more obviously circumstantial and opportunistic. I have to say, it's really, really impressive. And like as he pointed out in the press conference, not easy to stay within 5 seconds of a Red Bull in any circumstances. So we've been able to be there to take advantage of Checo's time penalty for the pit lane infringement was a testament to just how fast in those conditions he was. But it was obviously dry and wet that it worked. So I don't really know where that race pace came from. For it to have ended in a podium, I honestly wish I could offer a bit more detail for this podcast. But I think it was a very, very well managed race by Alpine and Gasly, and then when they got into a great bit of track position.
Yeah, and it was a surprise that they managed to thrive once up there and Gasly could stay there. But yeah, that's just Alpine this year. And I think it was a really strong performance from Gasly, actually. He's had a slightly tricky first part of the season, but yeah, I think that was a really impressive drive. I think all 3 of the drivers on the podium, as often you get in tricky races like this, really, really performed excellently. And of course, Esteban Ocon got that 10th place as well. He struggled even more and was eliminated in Q1, but managed to salvage a point there. He even gambled on taking the full wets just before the red flag, which he wasn't very happy with, but that was the right tire for the conditions. But pretty decent, I think, for Alpine, and a handy haul of points after their recent ructions. Mark, Ferrari, Carlos Sainz hung around near the front of the field for most of the race, ended up 5th. Charles Leclerc had a tough time after that Q3 crash and then retired after battling for 40-odd laps with floor damage from that Norris clash. So was this another downswing in Ferrari's up and down season, would you say?
Yeah, it was not suited to this circuit at all. I mean, even in the dry running that we saw On Friday, it was clear that they were in an awful lot of trouble. The car just didn't have a front end, and if it did have a front end, they didn't quite know what the rear end was going to do. And so, yeah, like these long corners tend to bring out the worst of it. And it just wasn't a competitive proposition. Sainz raced well with what he had, but ultimately it was a slower race car than the Alpine, let alone the usual cars that are up towards the front of the best of the rest after the Red Bull. So, yeah, I think Sainz sort of pulled a result out of the bag, really. Leclerc, he had that early bump with Oscar Piastri, and then he came into the pits at the right time, but he told them he was doing it as he was almost there. So he played his part in the tyres not being ready. But even so, as he pointed out, that was still that saved you more time, even with the tyres not being ready, than an extra lap in those conditions would have done on the wrong tyres.
I said to Sainz after the race that it looked like the Ferrari was the sixth fastest car here, which is probably the worst it's been all season. Have to go back and check. I'm sure there've been other races because it's got this astonishing variance in form of what it's capable of. But I know Sainz needed no invitation to sort of take that suggestion and run with it, because obviously he did a very good job both in qualifying and in the race. I don't think in a straight fight on merit a Ferrari should have been in the top six in qualifying or the Grand Prix. I'm forgetting exactly what it was Carlos said about the Inters in that final stint, but the reason he struggled with the Inters in the final stint and was massively under pressure from Hamilton and desperately trying to hang on was, I think he only had a worn set that he said was basically ruined from qualifying. He said as soon as he saw that those were the cut tyres they were putting on the car, he just thought he was going to go backwards. He was really pleased with his drive. He thinks that's absolutely one of the best drives he's done so far this season. And I have to say, Sainz is very good at, while Leclerc's fantastic at dragging something special from this Ferrari on its good days, I do really feel like Sainz has been really, really efficient at maximising it on the bad days. And that car's had quite a few bad days, none more so here. Leclerc's description of the car after qualifying, it sounded positively evil. I even suggested that it sounded like Leclerc needed to have Williams this weekend, which tells you all you need to know, not just about how bad the Ferrari was, but how good the Williams was.
Yeah, I think this might have been Sainz's strongest weekend of the season all round, because qualifying was really strong as well. I was very impressed with how he did. Let's move on now to McLaren, Scott. It promised so much, didn't it? But didn't deliver a great deal with 7th for Lando Norris, 9th for Oscar Piastri. That would have been a great result for the first few months of the season, but not now. So what do you think was possible had they got the strategy calls right, and what was their excuse for getting it wrong?
It's difficult to judge what would have been possible, because there were times in that Grand Prix where in the race, like, the car looked perfectly competitive and fine up at the front. But there were also moments where it didn't. And like Norris had a couple of rather underwhelming moments. He was really surprised at how much he struggled to get past Yuki Tsunoda in the middle phase of the Grand Prix, and then he couldn't do anything. I think it was Esteban Ocon's Alpine. He was stuck behind for a little bit as well in the next stint, in the final dry stint. So these moments made you think, oh, actually, the McLaren's clearly faster than these cars, but not by a massive amount. But then you look at that, the final few laps on Inters, he's all over the back of Hamilton and obviously Sainz because he was struggling. I'm sure he'd have been in the mix early on as well, but it was all undermined by the wrong decision at the start to stay out in the way that they did. Lando said that, I think Lando was calling for it quite hard over the team radio to come in, needed intermediates. Teams overruled him, and he's not happy about that. His point is that they obviously need to review it. McLaren said afterwards they do need to review it and understand, why did they give him the information they gave him to maybe try and dissuade him from wanting to pit. I'm a little bit, I don't want to draw an unfair parallel, but it did remind me a little bit of when McLaren blew the win in Russia in 2021, where it's just play what's in front of you. Stop, don't try and read too much into it. they weren't the only team to make that mistake by, trusting that this would only be a 2-minute shower and it would be moderate rather than heavy or whatever. But they clearly made the wrong decision, and it was a misexecution as a race team and something that they can't afford to do.
Yeah, and I think it's worth erasing Sochi because that's often misremembered by people. The misjudgment they had there was that there were 2 banks of rain. They were about a minute apart, and they failed to recognise the second one was there and bring the car in, which Mercedes did with Hamilton. Norris's decision was fine up to that point, but he didn't know there was another bank of rain coming. So, yeah, it's difficult in those circumstances. But positive for McLaren, they were performing well. Obviously, Piastri was a little bit frustrated. He had that crash on Friday that obviously led to the Ricciardo injury as well when Ricciardo went off effectively in avoidance, and then obviously he was quick in the wet but didn't qualify as well as he hoped, and then had a solid race to 9th. But I guess McLaren can be happy that that's a disappointing weekend for them. Now the fundamental pace in fits and starts was pretty good. Mark, let's also talk about Mercedes. Similar story in many ways. Toto Wolff had some pretty choice words for them, didn't he, after the strategic failings? He used the words catastrophic and subpar. So Lewis Hamilton was 6th. George Russell was last after picking up that puncher in a late brush with Norris. So did Mercedes really get it so badly wrong?
Yes, they did, but only in hindsight. It's easy to judge these things and measure them and say this was catastrophically bad. Yes, it was. But that doesn't equate with how bad a decision it was, if you see what I mean, because you don't have, as you're talking about just there, you don't have the information precise enough to call it. You don't know how long the shower is there for and how heavy it's going to be. You have a rough indication, but nothing precise enough to really make scientific judgments on. And yeah, they got themselves caught between 2 stools. They were a little bit slow in recognizing what Perez's pace was, after he stopped on the first lap, and they missed that little window by a few seconds of getting in on the next lap, and so they ended up in the catastrophically bad third lap onwards. If you missed the lap 2 window, you're better staying out. That's stuff you can measure in hindsight. You can't measure it beforehand because you don't know what it's going to be.
Yeah, exactly. It's very, very easy to be knowledgeable with what you know what happens later, isn't it? That's just the nature of things. But was frustrating for them because the car was pretty good round Zandvoort. Obviously, Russell went into the race saying he was forecast for a podium, so he was pretty disappointed with the way it went. And then obviously Hamilton had the problems in qualifying, a little bit of bad luck with traffic and that kind of thing, and the Tsunoda impeding, and then not having the tyres at their best for when he did do his lap at the end of the session. So yeah, just one of those weekends, and when it's so congested there, it's very easy for it to go wrong. Let's move on to Williams now, Scott, because they're a bit of a strange one this weekend because everyone inside and outside Williams, including in the team, their predictions, expects it to be a difficult weekend. So how exactly did Alex Albon qualify on the second row and finish 8th in what was predicted to be a car that struggled to get out of Q1?
You need to add something to that as well, Ed. Finish a slightly disappointing 8th.
Yeah.
He felt that 6th was possible in this Grand Prix. I suppose the way it played out and the roller coaster he was on at times, he's probably relieved just to get some points at the end of it. But it was funny listening to him, Logan Sargeant to a degree after qualifying, but Alex in particular, because I asked him, how do you explain that pace? And he's just sort of shrugged, laughed and said, I don't really. There were a lot of factors that went into it. I'll actually throw to Mark in a second to explain some of them in a little bit more detail, because he did a great piece on the race website after qualifying, sort of explaining it. But the point I would just make is that a lot of teams observed that Williams has been showing evidence of actually really improving this into a quite nice little all-round car, like actually just quite a good functioning, got a bit more downforce racing car now. And the other thing is that they don't just, it's not just that they take all the wing off of it and that's when they become competitive now. It's actually they've got a bit of room to play with. Albon was quite keen to point out that this wasn't just, they're getting a massive straight line speed advantage here and that's what they have So they'll be able to hang on to their track position because of this. They generated their pace in a slightly different way today, and the fact that the car was quick in the dry and the wet, I think just showed that it was fundamentally just a good car at Zandvoort. But I'm going to let Mark do the heavy lifting here and explain why it was a better car at Zandvoort.
Yeah, it's still light on downforce. They hadn't suddenly found a lot more downforce, even though this Zandvoort is a downforce track. But what it also is, especially in wet or changeable conditions, is a track which heavily rewards a car with a good drivable balance. It's got lots of places where it can go badly wrong, and there's not much runoff in a lot of places, and it's very narrow and it's bumpy in places. So yeah, it does reward a drivable balance, and then Williams has achieved that. It hasn't got a lot of downforce, but it's delivered in quite a nice way. And Albon was keyed into it and really, really got on with it. He also made the point that the headwind was in its rare counter-prevailing direction in qualifying. The prevailing direction is tailwind at the turn 9, which, as he explained, is catastrophically bad for them. It loses them 2/10 through there and another 2/10 through turn 11. He said, but if it just somehow flips around, and this was before this was on Thursday, he was saying this, if it just somehow flips around 180 degrees, he says it's magically better for us. He says, well, you lose like half a tenth or so, so but he wasn't expect that to happen, and that they got it. They got the 180 degree switch into Saturday. Well, on Friday and into Saturday as well, and so that helped them. But yeah, it's not suddenly going to be a car that's threatening on a regular basis. Mercedes, Aston Martin, McLaren, and if you looked at how far it actually was off Verstappen's pole, it was only slightly better than its seasonal average. There's a lot of other cars that should have been ahead of it weren't. Lewis Hamilton's McLaren, the Ferraris. So you got to put it in the correct perspective. Yes, they did a fantastic job, and the car's not bad, but a lot of that fourth place on the grid was down to other underperformance from others.
But the huge thing is that even those 4 points, that puts Williams clear in 7th place in the Constructors' Championship. It might not sound like much, but each Constructors' Championship position these days can be worth 10 million plus. So the difference between being last and 7th is pretty enormous, and they've taken a good step there towards consolidating that position against Haas and Alfa Romeo and AlphaTauri, who are also in that battle. But Scott, obviously it's been Alex Albon really who's taken 7th in the Constructors, because Logan Sargeant hasn't scored. And again, a mixed bag of a weekend for him, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. I felt a little bit bad earlier actually, because I was making a point on the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, just about how tightly contested that fight for 7th in the championship is, and you're right, it's really valuable, and it's for those teams it's a big deal whether you finish 7th, 8th, 9th or 10th, because there's not been that many points separating them. And I framed it as it's Alex Albon on 15 points, and then Haas on 11, I think Alfa Romeo on 9, and AlphaTauri or Yuki Tsunoda are on 3 points. And it wasn't meant to be a jab at Sargeant. It was just meant to be, look, Alex Albon is single-handedly outscoring 3 entire F1 teams. That's how good a job he's doing this year. But it also does serve to illustrate the problem in that team, in that car has been capable of scoring points. They've not got that haul for the same reasons they did a couple of years ago. You remember when they had that double points finish in Hungary, and then Russell's quote-unquote podium in the quote-unquote Belgian Grand Prix. These are points that Albon has scored by being quick enough in a car that's quick enough to score points, and a better driver, a more experienced driver in the other car would have scored points as well. That's just a fact. And Sargeant continues to show flashes, but he continues to under-deliver. And this weekend was quite an extreme manifestation of that, in that he got through into Q3, which was great, and the team were really happy about that. But he was never close enough to Albon on pace in the wet. I think he was probably more respectable in the dry, but no better than maybe 3/10 off of Albon, probably in the dry. And in an ideal scenario, had qualifying been in normal conditions. And in the Grand Prix, obviously, and then obviously he crashed in qualifying, which was a big setback. And then he crashed out of the Grand Prix as well. I don't think it was his fault. It does seem that hitting the apex curve, I think through turn 8, I think it was, seems to have caused a hydraulics failure of some kind that then lost power steering, ran wide, shunted, obviously. I don't want to be too harsh and say that should count against him, but he'd already not done a great job up to that point. He'd had a very timid first lap and lost a load of ground. So the bar's kind of moved a little bit, but it's still very much within that genre of flashes, but not building on it. And James Vowles, the Williams team boss, said at the start of this weekend, we need to see a better rate of progress now. And I don't know. I feel like there might have been a little bit of a step in the right direction this weekend, but not by enough. There does need to be a bigger step than this.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's stuttering progress again, and he really needs to string something together. There's still promising peaks. If he can just join those together, he can have a bit of a run and I think consolidate that seat. But the longer it goes on without it happening, the harder it gets. And yeah, 2 accidents, even if one of them wasn't really his fault, won't help that particular cause. But yeah, we have to say great effort from Albon, particularly the way he hung on those slicks in the wet in very, very difficult conditions. Actually, Sargeant had to do the same thing. He got through the worst of it and then the accidents happened later. But yeah, a good weekend for Williams. And we should also say it was a weekend when there were opportunities for others. Joe in the Alfa Romeo ran as high as 2nd. Yuki Tsunoda ran as high as 4th in the Alfa Tauri. Kevin Magnussen was up in the points early on as well. So the rivals did have opportunities, but they ultimately weren't quick enough to capitalise on them. And of course, Joe in the end crashed out. So yeah, a big step for Williams there in that battle. Well, as always, we'll finish off with a section dedicated to questions from the Race Members Club. For more information on the Race Members Club, click on Join the Race on our website, and you too could have the opportunity to send us questions for our post-race podcast. We've had loads of questions this week. We'll try and get through as many as we can, starting with this one for you, Mark, from Christopher Parrott, who says, when was the best lap to pit for Inters and then to pit back to slicks? And then back to Inters again? And did any teams time it perfectly? You've already half answered that, but what's the ideal strategy and who was closest?
Perez, I guess, was quite close. Well, Perez got the first one right. I'd have to look through the pit stop list just to see who stopped when on the second ones, but I don't know.
You can cheat and say Red Bull.
Yeah,
it's like it was Red Bull, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. It was probably about lap 8 would have been ideal to get back onto the slicks. Lap 1 on the Inters and lap 8ish, maybe 9 onto the slicks, and then everybody was pretty much the same on getting on the Inters.
No one was going to make the same mistake twice, were they? So as soon as it started raining, everyone came in.
Yeah,
and it's difficult because, of course, what time you make the stop is also slightly influenced by your race situation later on as well. So yeah, a very, very difficult one. I don't think anyone got it absolutely 100% right on all of them. In fact, there was always some plus or minus, shall we say. Scott, a question from Henriette Haler, who says, I was absolutely screaming at the TV, you have to be on the right tyre at the right time. Surely with all of the amazing tech available in F1, teams shouldn't be making such amateur-looking mistakes when it comes to tyres.
I get where this question is coming from completely, and I think we all probably have had that thought at some point. The main thing I would say is that when you're trying to make a decision, you're basically balancing it against depending on the circuit, obviously, but a 40 to 50 second time loss, because you're working out because you're going to lose a pit stop changing to the tyres, and then if you're thinking it's only going to be an isolated downpour, you're going to change back.
So you're going to lose 40 seconds.
Yeah, so you've got 2 pit stops to account for if that situation plays out as it's most likely to in this scenario.
So you can be on a situation where you're on the wrong tyres and what you know are the wrong tyres for those 2 laps, but it's absolutely going to be the right strategy. So it doesn't follow that you should just be on the right tyre on every lap. That can actually lead to a catastrophically bad strategy. So it's a sort of cliched thing, but it works both ways. And it's in the moment trying to work out which of those two ways it's going to be.
Because it's not just you have to be on the right tyre at the right time. You have to be on the right tyre that will give you the best race time. And between, let's say, in this instance, it's lap 1 to 8. If lap 8 is the ideal lap to get back on the slicks, what's the combination of tyre from lap 1 to lap 8 through these conditions that give you that best race time? And the way the teams thought that rain shell play out was that you'd basically have to survive 1, maybe 2 laps with the track at its wettest, and then that's it, you'd be fine. But the guys that stayed out on slicks were hemorrhaging lap time so much. And of course, if they'd known it was going to be that bad, they'd have been straight in. So it's just a little bit more complicated than it does look. It's very simple in principle, but it is a little bit more complicated than that. And I don't say that to be patronising. I say that I understand that position because I've been that annoyed at teams for making what look like simple errors myself. But especially in a situation like this, where it doesn't look like there's a massive wall of rain approaching for half an hour, it's just a little bit of a more nuanced decision.
Yeah, and of course it is difficult as well because the information is imperfect. On that first lap, for example, it rained very late on the lap. And while there was that camera shot that looked very, very wet, and I saw that and thought, well, they're going to have to come in now. That's just one snapshot of data that you've got very, very little time to respond to, and you don't know how much is settling, that kind of thing. And then you've got the question of, well, once you've missed an opportunity, do you keep going around? Once you've done a couple of laps, do you stay out and just accept that you've lost that and you can't get it back, or do you avoid that because you think, oh, that's just a sunk cost fallacy, so no, we just need to bail out now? So it's very, very complicated, and I think the nature of rain, as soon as you've got that variable, it's a very imprecise variable that you can't fully anticipate. So I think that's what creates the problem. The only thing I would say is I think sometimes there's maybe a degree of flat-footedness because the teams are set up for this data-heavy, really analytical, brilliantly executed strategic analysis. And when things change that quickly, it's really dynamic. And sometimes you do need a bit of a reaction and gut feel, but that can go both ways. So yeah, again, easy to criticise. Question now I'll take from Justin Marshall, who says, with wet weather again playing a role at Zandvoort, does it raise the question that less practice may be the better format? It's certainly made for entertaining qualifying, but if a format change happens to reduce practice, how do you increase the on-track time for us punters to watch? Well, yes, less practice is a better format in terms of unpredictability. In terms of how you increase the track time for punters, ultimately, no matter what the form of track time, the more track time there is, the more fettled they will be by the race and the more they will know. So it's a very difficult balance. I guess the simple answer is you have the Domenicali way and you have more sessions that mean something, which is more sprint weekends and that kind of thing. But yeah, not necessarily an easy answer to that, because I think as soon as you get a steady state weekend with normal running, whether it's a race or extra qualifying sessions or whatever, you're learning every time, even with that part for May situation. So yeah, it's not a two-dimensional problem. It's very much a three-dimensional problem, that one, but a good principle to go for because it does mix things up. Mark, a question for you from Ben Johnson, who says, in an era of higher red flag usage, how can we expedite the process of getting action happening again? A 10-minute warning is fair enough, but there have been so many instances where we wait what feels like an age for no reason before the restart is called.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that we could have probably got underway a little bit earlier today. But sometimes they are actually waiting for a bigger window of racing if they're watching the radar, and it seems like you're sitting there watching a track which is perfectly raceable and we're not racing. So you naturally think, well, let's get on with it. But sometimes it's because they know that it's going to be another red flag 5 laps from now, and if they just wait another 15 minutes, then they can get to the end. So it's just down to I don't think there's anything intrinsically in the system which builds up that delay. I think it's just trying to anticipate it in the best way possible. And sometimes, it's like in hindsight talking about when the best time to pit was. It's just like that. You're dealing with something that's not entirely predictable. It's only in the Vegas sense.
I would add very quickly on that for this one. I haven't actually checked this, but it's just my logical assumption. We were trying to avoid everyone having to run the full wets behind the safety car for the restart, because you didn't want everybody then piling in for intermediates because the pit lane's so small. So I have a suspicion that they did let it run a little bit longer before resuming, just so the track conditions were intermediate usable. Yeah, basically, just to avoid, because that's why everyone will remember who watched the race. Everyone was allowed to take. They weren't just allowed. They were told they have to be on the inters behind the safety car for the restart. I have a suspicion that elongated that red flag period just so that we could definitely use the inters safely.
Plus, it's worth remembering there's now a 3-hour window for the whole race to happen in. The maximum race time is 2 hours and it's a 3-hour window. So they know they've got that window to play with. So I think that perhaps engineers in a bit of conservatism if they know they've got the time to do it. The next question for you, Scott, comes from Danny Danielski, who says, why do we have extreme wet tyres when they're only used for a safety car start? And if the track gets wet enough for them, the race just gets red flagged?
Danny, I'll answer this question quickly. That's mainly because, if you go back on a couple of podcasts we've recorded, we've spoken about this in a little bit more detail. But the wet tyre is not good enough, and the pace deficit to the intermediate is extraordinarily bad. And there needs to be a better crossover window. There needs to be a better middle ground between these two compounds. So you use the full wet tyres because it helps to clear a load of water. It's a safer tyre to use when conditions would be run behind a safety car or red flag, i.e. there's a lot of water on the track. But really, once you go racing, you need the intermediate because that's just a much, much faster tyre. Pirelli are working on it, but this is what we've got at the moment. We've got a safety car tyre that has a very, very, very finite, a very, very, very narrow window of use. We saw it had that window of use a couple of times today, and it barely got used. So it wasn't needed.
Yeah, exactly. And it's worth noting that basically if you're on the full wet tyre, the visibility is going to be so bad, you're not going to be able to race under it. So it's going to be a safety car or a red flag. So as well as the underperformance, there's also, of those tyres, there's also that problem. So yeah, plenty to be solved there. The spray guards, of course, are being worked on, although I'm not holding my breath for them. That's a very, very challenging project. The next question I'll take comes from Phil Wright, who says, were you surprised to see Haas retain Kevin Magnussen, given the way in which Hülkenberg has outperformed in this year? Is there a danger of Haas being sentimental rather than looking for the absolute best they can get for the second car? No, I wasn't surprised they retained Magnussen, but certainly I see 100% where you're coming from there. Magnussen has had a very poor season. He's struggled with the characteristics of the car, so he hasn't been able to generally extract that qualifying pace out of the car that Hülkenberg has, with the exception of Miami, I think, where he qualified really well. So yeah, it's been a very difficult season for Magnussen, but there is a clear reason for it. I think what you get with Magnussen is when things are going well, you can get some really good performances. But when he gets into a bit of a rut like this, it can be quite difficult. I think they'll be expecting next year to have a car that he can work with a bit better, and hopefully both of them will be up there. Ultimately, Haas are 8th, 9th, 10th in the queue for drivers. So they're not going to be signing superstars. So you have to look at what's there. Of the experienced drivers, which they say they want, I don't think the alternatives are in any way better than Magnussen and Hülkenberg that they've got. And of the up-and-comers, which they're wary of, there's no sort of super mega talent that they'll be able to lay their hands on. So, yeah, I'm not surprised they've kept Magnussen for that reason. I think it's a pretty logical, sensible move. But, yeah, he has had a pretty poor season. I don't think they're being sentimental. They got rid of him last time. They get rid of him again if they felt there was a better alternative. But they'll be hoping there's better times ahead for him. Next question for you, Mark, comes from Lachlan Babbage, who says, has Yuki Tsunoda proved that he could be a viable candidate to replace Sergio Perez in the future, or will Red Bull shop elsewhere if they decide Perez needs to go?
I don't get the sense that they are thinking of him as a Red Bull driver. I think they see him improving, and he's done a pretty solid job for the last couple of years. But, a Red Bull driver is someone who ideally is going to stick it on the front row and finish second to Max Verstappen. And I don't get the sense that Red Bull feel that that's the level of performance he would achieve in that car. So, yeah, the question then becomes what is his function within the program? And at the moment, it's for doing a good job within AlphaTauri. But it's harsh. But I think he is a good driver that's fully worthy of his place on the grid. I may be wrong, but I don't see him as a regular Grand Prix winner, even if you put him in a top team.
A related question for you, Scott, from Liam Robertson, who says, do you think Perez is the right man for the job for 2024 and beyond? And if not, who's a reasonable replacement and why?
He can be. He's proven several times that he can be. It's just whether or not he can do that consistently. That's the big question mark. And obviously it depends what advantage car-wise Red Bull has next year. If it's this again, then Perez is absolutely fine for the job, isn't he? He's a decent number 2. He's there or thereabouts more often than not. And he lets Max Verstappen do his thing and be as good as Max Verstappen is. So in that sense, it does work. One of the reasons I think he's probably the right man for the job is that realistically, I don't see any standout replacements. I said earlier, thin chance of Daniel Ricciardo maybe. If they wanted to take a massive punt, they could just decide, Liam Lawson's done really impressively. Let's just put him in at Red Bull Racing. You could promote Tsunoda. The drivers have been their existing stable of the contenders, and none of them strike me as an obvious upgrade on Perez. Ricciardo could be, but we've now got even less of a chance to find out, haven't we? So, I think given the options available, keeping Perez for 2024 and honouring the contract is just the path of least resistance.
The next question I'll take from Hannah Partridge says, Max Verstappen seems to have already won the 2023 championship and Verstappen and Red Bull are aware of this. Checo, however, will need to gain more points for a definite Red Bull 1-2 in the championship. Why is Red Bull's number one strategy always in favour of Max when he has enough of a gap to win the championship and not Checo? Well, I think it just comes down to usually the number one strategy does favour the quicker driver. They're normally in the better position to benefit from it. Obviously, there was the question mark today, but ultimately Verstappen was the quicker driver. And I think even if they had done the pit stops the other way round, I think Verstappen would probably still have won. Perez is in quite a good position for second. He should be able to get second in the championship, which would be nice for Red Bull to get a 1-2 because they haven't had one before. So I think it's just the natural competitive order ultimately, and there have been times where Perez has benefited as well and been allowed to stay ahead, etc., such as we saw earlier in the season. So it's just one of those things. If you're a good driver up against an all-time great, it's really tough, and that kind of thing happens, and Perez isn't the first to experience that. Mark, a question from Jeremy Husted, who says, given their repeated false dawns, if Mercedes continues to fail in their quest for another championship, should we start comparing them to Williams and their fall from grace in 1998?
I think that'd be a bit harsh. Williams sort of straddled two eras and then sort of fell down as the game became much bigger and more complicated. It wasn't that the environment stayed the same and Williams just fell down. It was that they were just not equipped for the new, bigger F1 with multiple hundreds of employees and
left behind. But they were just left behind, weren't they, by the changing pace?
Yeah, the game changed completely and they didn't keep up. But Mercedes is not in that position. Mercedes is in a position, it's still an absolutely top team. It's taken a wrong turn with a specific design, and it's taken a couple of seasons to dig themselves out. We'll find out next year if it's going to take 3 years or whether this is we're towards the end of that difficult period. But I mean, it's still second in the championship. It's got a pole position this year. It's a podium contender pretty much everywhere we go. So it's not a disaster. It's just we're up against one of the all-time great combination of car and driver.
Scott, a question from Daniel Roberts, who says, my question concerns the atmosphere at the Dutch Grand Prix this weekend. With Christian Horner, the teams and the media complaining about the constant loud techno music throughout the weekend in Zandvoort and the regular problems with Dutch fans setting off flares in the grandstands, is the atmosphere in the grandstands distracting from the racing and spoiling the experience for fans? And is F1 doing enough to promote a safe and welcoming environment for all supporters?
I didn't think so. I think we have a nice range now across the whole season of different mixes of types of races, classic and new, and this is quite an interesting one because it's a classic race and track revived in a very new, very specific way. And I quite like the different vibes, to be honest. I said, I joked at the start of the podcast, it's not my preference of music, and I've worked in quieter media centres, but it massively lends itself to the atmosphere here. It's very, very, very much a home Max Verstappen race. I don't think it crosses any lines in terms of behaviour. If there is any evidence or stories of anything sinister or wrong genuinely being done by people getting carried away, then, or just plain acting badly, then of course my opinion on that would be very different. I haven't seen or heard anything of that. I feel like this is a good race and a good addition to the calendar in its current form. So I'm quite happy with it.
And the final question I'll take comes from Jack Aitken, and it is our Jack Aitken, not the XF Williams driver. The Zandvoort circuit in its high bank corners looks spectacular on TV. Does this extreme banking improve the racing, and do you think we could see banked corners considered more in future F1 circuit designs? Yeah, it certainly improves the racing, and Fernando Alonso made the most of it. It's great to watch the cars there. They are, unfortunately, tricky to build, and more importantly, expensive to build. So that's the main challenge. I think a lot of circuits would like that, but may balk at the cost. But I think it'll be interesting to see, particularly when it comes to some of the new circuits that are being built, whether they'll integrate this sort of thing. So hopefully so. And a bit of camber and undulation and all those things, banking, all of that is good to make the racing more interesting and the circuit more challenging. Well, thanks very much to everyone for your questions. Sorry we couldn't get through all of them. And as always, thanks to Scott and Mark for your words of wisdom. For more of those, head to therace.com and don't forget the hyphen, because there's loads to read there. Subscribe to our other podcasts, including the Race F1 Tech Show with the legend that is Gary Anderson, and our MotoGP and IndyCar podcasts, as well as Bring Back V10s. And also check out our YouTube channel for our in-depth videos on F1 past and present. The races are coming thick and fast, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the Italian Grand Prix.